Massacre. This was the name of the movie that we all watched, and I hope the film has reminded us all of the memories of the massacre. But to be honest, 1 hour, as I said, 1 hour is not enough to explain the great suffering, the sense of fear, and the attempts to survive for those who were inside the Rab'a at the time. I'm thrilled to moderate this critical conversation with our fantastic group of panelists, and we will have 3 rounds of questions, and you can participate in the conversation after the second round. There will be Q&A. So let me welcome our honorable speakers. Peter Auburn, award-winning British journalist, columnist, author, and commentator on politics for television and radio. And Dalia Fahmi, director of the International Relations and Diplomacy Program and the associate professor of political science at Long Island University. And Crispin Plant, conservative member of the British Parliament and the former House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee chairman. And Amr Magdi, senior researcher, Middle East and North Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. And Khalid Shalabi, eyewitness to the Rab'a massacre and journalist at Middle East Eye. Welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. Crispin, I will kick off this conversation with you. You had a distinguished participation in the film, and as far as I know, you were the only European politician who visited the Rab'a sit-in twice before the massacre in the 14th of August, and you tried to prevent the bloodshed. Tell us more about these visits and what happened.
Well, by complete coincidence, I had a former constituent who was a British national but of Egyptian extraction, and he was a hotelier by background, and he had ended up looking after President Sadat, I think. And as a result of that, he was running two five-star hotels in Cairo, one in Cairo, one in Luxor years later. And they were, in 1990, they were expropriated by the Mubarak regime. And by 1997, I was elected as Member of Parliament for Reigate. He came to see me to assist his effort to get some recompense for the way the hotels were taken off him. And by some miracle, the case went to the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes in New York, and under the treaty between the United Kingdom and Egypt about settlement of investment disputes, he got recompense. And during the course of that time, he had become devout, and he engaged with members of the Egyptian Islamist movement of the Brotherhood. In its widest sense, he had set up a medical center in Cairo, and so I had this extraordinary introduction to the world of Egyptian politics. And at the beginning of July 2013, he came to see me. Actually, what he came to see me about was to try and get a visa for a family relative to give him a transplant. He needed to save his life. But it obviously gave me the opportunity then to go and visit, and I took the opportunity to go twice with him in July, and each time we were able to get into the square and to talk to the leadership who were in the square, those that hadn't been arrested. And I dare say that people would be obviously people here who I met at their time there, and my comments there at the end obviously reflected my conclusions as to what I'd seen. And I left on the 31st of July 2013, and I messaged the Middle East Minister, Alistair Burt, to say we needed to démarche the Egyptians, because if they did what was plainly being planned, because all the on Egyptian television, and as I left, you could sense that the population were being prepared for the scale of bloodshed that was likely to occur if what was planned did actually happen. And at least then it appeared, it looked as though it was imminent on the 31st of July. But 2 weeks later, obviously whatever had been said between the British government and Western governments and the Egyptian military failed to have any effect, and what happened happened, and it's obviously a terrible outcome for the people who were there, and I think the film did huge credit to it. But it's also a pretty awful outcome for Western policy and the things that we support. and supposed to support about human rights. It's a terrible rebuke.
Yeah, we will discuss in a minute the British government policy towards the Rabba massacre. But Khalid, you were then 10 years ago. And what's your impression of the film, firstly, and what memories do you have of the massacre?
Oh, thank you so much, Osama, for having me today and for giving me opportunity to share my experience during Rabba at this time. Um, I just have like a few points that I want to raise regarding what we have seen in the documentary and what I have witnessed in that day. Initially, the sit-in in Rab'a Square was established by President Morsi supporters in reaction of the demonstration against his administration. But after the 3rd of July and the well-known speech of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi announcing the coup, everyone was reacting just to protect the democratic transition and what we have gained after the revolution. I have this quote that I still remember from one of my close friends from at the Dastur party, which led by Dr. Mohammed
Baradei.
Al-Baradei. And after the speech, he just called me and said, Khalid, it's over. We lost. This is our last fight against the military. And we just, both of us like were just silent and crying. Because we know from the very beginning that the deep state will not allow us to carry on with what we have gained after the revolution. After that, what I can remember from the massacre itself, what happened in the hospital, in Rabba Hospital. Rabba Hospital was surrounded from the very beginning, and everyone was targeted around the area and even in the entrance. Anyone who tried to rescue wounded people or tried to enter to the hospital was targeted by snipers. Even before storming the hospital, they fired tear gas inside and live bullets targeting people inside randomly. The bodies, wounded people were just all over the floors. It was just a big mass. You can see even the kids that they were trying to protect them with their families, women's, all over, everywhere, between bodies, between wounded and injured people. After they stormed the hospital, they gave a very tight time to evacuate, and they refused to evacuate anyone who can't walk by himself. I remember that one of the doctors was just pleading them to move the injuries all over the floors outside the hospital, and they just very clearly said, if you don't leave, you will die.
In the movie, one of the officers told the doctor in the field hospital, let them die.
Let them die.
Yeah.
So it was very clearly that the plan from the beginning that if what they will do, that they will burn everything, they will burn the evidence, they will burn people, even if they are still alive, just to hide what they have done during that day. The safe route after evacuating the hospital was just about 30 minutes maximum. Before and after that, it was just random shots and bullets towards them, which left a lot of casualties.
Yeah.
As I remember as well, there was like one thing that 1 week before the dispersal, one of the military sources that I have contact, who was just trying to warn us about what was happening, but he just said that he was trying to assure us that everything will be aligned with the guide of the riot control, and it will be just including like the use of water and tear gas, and maybe arrest of the key figures of the sit-in. He even couldn't imagine that something like that similar will happen, which like show you that clearly was like a well-planned operation by the military at all its level.
Yeah, regarding the plan, let me go to Amr. Amr, we watched the film. There is a story and testimonies there, and Khalid told us about his testimony. But in August 2014, Human Rights Watch published one of the most important and informative reports about the massacre, titled "All According to Plan: The Rabba Massacre and Mass Killing of Protesters in Egypt." Would you please remind us of the main findings of your report?
Thank you, Osama. I just dropped my mic, so I don't know if you hear me.
It's working, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for honoring me being with you here tonight and for making time, basically, to remember this important day, which I think is really, there is Egypt before Rabba and Egypt after Rabba, and there will be no future for this country without addressing what happened that day. The report that Human Rights Watch produced in 2014, I didn't really have the honor of working on that report. I actually joined the organization just the month when it was released. It was other colleagues, Omar Shaker and Heba Muraif and other colleagues who worked on the report, which took almost a year-long investigation. And really a lot of researchers working on this report, interviewing almost 200 witnesses, survivors, families of the victims, lawyers, and also visiting the morgue, visiting the, doing field research in the square during the protests, analyzing satellite images, footage, and it was really a huge teamwork to come with the findings and the conclusions in almost 190 pages, one of the longest reports actually in the history of the organizations. And the main findings is basically what my former director, Sarli, was saying in the film, that this was a plan, a very, premeditated and very, intended plan to evacuate and disperse the protests, whatever the cost is. And maybe I would remind you of a few official statements. Obviously, most of the official statements were exonerating security forces from any wrongdoing, but actually, at the same time, before and after the dispersal, there were quite, I would say, mesmerizing official statements that said conveyed clearly that the government, the authorities back then in the interim government had in mind that they would kill up to 10% of the people in the square during the evacuation. That was a statement, if I remember correctly, by Mohammed Ibrahim, the interior minister. There was also a close meeting to which a few human rights activists and journalists were invited on August 5th, almost 10 days before the massacre. And in that meeting, it was conveyed to the people in the meeting that the estimated number of dead people, if dispersal happens, will be between 3,500 to 5,000 people. So it was really a plan to disperse the protest and to punish people for protesting in support of President Morsi. I think the plan was not just to actually disperse the protests, but actually to punish the people and to make an example of what comes next. And that's why I think the question about whether June 30th was a revolution or a coup is really irrelevant and a bit idiotic. It doesn't matter. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. It's a political question, whatever you support. But what happened next is what matters. And what happened next in the following weeks and months and years is actually the worst experience of authoritarianism we have experienced in Egypt and our country.
The regime is still arguing this point, Amr. He's still saying Rab'a sit-in wasn't a peaceful protest, and they arguing your report regarding the number of atrocities in the report.
First, it was actually acknowledged by the officials during that day, if you remember, that the health ministry was issuing updates about the number of casualties, and they were counting up to 600 something. And then it was also said in a press statement, I think by El-Biblawi, Prime Minister El-Biblawi, that the number of people killed were around 1,000. And that's also what Human Rights Watch said in the report. It was likely over 1,000. I think what's important here is also to remember that the government, the authorities, commissioned two different forms of sort of like fact-finding committees. One was established by the National Council for Human Rights, and the other was established by Adli Mansour, the interim president. They never actually published the full report of that committee, but only the executive summary, I think, was published in 2016. And the report by the National Council for Human Rights was published in 2014. And actually, this government-appointed council said in the report that the government failed to provide safe exits for the protesters. It said that the government used excessive force. It said that the government failed to provide medical, emergency medical care for the wounded, which all violates, basic logic, basic morals before international norms. And I think it's really hard to dispute the numbers, and it's really the responsibility of the authorities to reveal what happened during that day. And even when Sisi became officially the president, the new constitution in 2014 had article number 241 that said that the parliament in the first session must issue a transitional justice law to actually establish the truth of what happened and to, just bring forward accountability and compensation for the victims. And it was not necessarily mentioning, or it was not necessarily addressing the Rabba Square massacre, but just what happened since the 2011 revolution.
Okay, Dalia, from an academic perspective, what did Rabba mean to Egypt, Middle East, and the whole world?
So we have to remember that the election of President Morsi was the first democratic election to occur in the Middle East. And that signaled that democracy was not just possible, but that was going to remain a threat for the rest of Middle Eastern regimes. David Kirkpatrick wrote a book on the influence of Gulf countries on the military coup and the subsequent, the aftermath, but also the lead up, the funding of the civil society organization Tamarrud. And so since the 1940s, there has always been a bifurcation in the Middle East of hyper-nationalism versus Islamism. And if Islamism would win, then it's going to be at the expense of the nation. And that's why what is most significant about Rabba is not just the massacre. That day, the Independent, the headline was Egypt's Day of Shame. It's actually not. It was celebrated by Egyptians and continues to be celebrated by Egyptians. And so what you see is the rise of hyper-nationalism to face this perceived Islamist threat. And when we look at us in the greater context, this is exactly what Middle Eastern dictators from Syria all the way to Gulf countries needed. They needed for this democratic experiment to fail. Think about it not just in the context of Egypt and what it would mean. It would mean that 3 generations that had not been allowed to participate in politics could finally have a voice, a say, and a window into the future based on their interest. That legitimacy came from the people. Now, Egypt's not immune to the laws of political science, meaning when there are winners, there are also losers. For the people to win, for democracy to hold, then the military had to be removed from politics. The deep state had to be reformed. That the entire institution of governance in Egypt would have to be redefined if it was going to be in the name of the people. And if that were to happen in Egypt, it would have to happen in the rest of the Middle East. Looking at this in the greater context in terms of foreign policy, and I know we're going to get to this a little bit later, but think about what it would mean when there were critical foreign policy decisions being made by President Morsi that were saying he said one time when the atrocities in Syria were increasing, because the levels of repression in Syria followed Egypt, right? It became a symbol. This is how you control a population. You make the violence much worse than anticipated. And President Morsi at that time had said, "Labbaik ya Syria," right? Syria, we're coming for you. What does that mean? That the entire political regional dynamics would be redefined. And that couldn't happen. After the removal of President Morsi, we saw Israel go into Gaza. That was not going to happen if President Morsi was still president. And so if you look at the greater geopolitical positioning of Egypt vis-a-vis the rest of the Middle East, Rabba had to occur to bring the attention back to domestic politics and to redefine Egypt's position in the world, but also in the region. The people celebrating this moment. You saw David Kirkpatrick say that the press was saying these are cockroaches. The term cockroaches, right? How do you kill a cockroach? You can't spray it, you have to smash it, you have to eliminate it. This language of cockroach was used in Rwanda, was used in Srebrenica, was used in the Holocaust, was used in Cambodia. And so when you think about ultimately what this was a genocide. And if it's a genocide, which is violence against, state violence against a population, to eliminate them, which is reflected in the Human Rights Report. They don't say genocide, I'm saying genocide, because that's the international definition. Then not just is this a crime against humanity, but that this needs to be tried in the International Court of Justice.
And Peter, regarding the foreign policy, a month before the Rabba massacre, you wrote an article in the Telegraph, and I quote, "William Hague is betraying Britain's values in its response to the Egyptian coup." You strongly criticized the British foreign minister at the time. So as a journalist, how do you evaluate the British government dealing with the Rabba massacre at time? And is anything changed during the last 10 years?
Yeah, it has to be understood. It has to be understood that Britain's foreign policy in the Middle East and across most of the rest of the world is structurally to favor dictatorship, and it's very hostile to democratic movements, unless they're sponsored by the West, and certainly very hostile to movements like within political Islam and the Brotherhood. And so Hague made a very weak response to the coup d'etat, and in fact the British government has never used the term coup d'etat. And as for John Kerry, he actually welcomed the arrival of Sisi, praising him for restoring democracy to Egypt. This is what John Kerry, then the Secretary of State, managed to come up with. And so whether or not the British government was in some way complicit with the coup d'etat and what followed, it's no question that what happened fitted perfectly with British government policy. As you could see very shortly afterwards, Sisi turned up in London in 2014 to visit David Cameron. There was a very brief and perfunctory cessation of arms sales to Egypt, and they started again almost at once. There was a wretched ambassador, John Casson, who was obviously mandated by the British Foreign Office to suck up to Sisi, and they immediately started using the term terrorist about the Brotherhood activists. That became the language, particularly from visiting ministers who now like to project themselves as being very benign, like Alistair Burt, who presents himself as a bit of a saint these days, but wasn't then. He was part of the British policy of supporting Sisi and that kind of murderous despotism, which very much suited the interests of the West. And has anything changed? Of course not. That's precisely where we are now. Sisi is a valued ally of America, Britain, the West, and of course, and this is something the film didn't deal with. It was an amazing film, I thought, a brilliant film, absolutely terribly moving. Didn't deal with the role of neighbouring powers because that very interesting hint, suddenly those mysterious petrol strikes, etc. It didn't deal with the role of neighbouring powers, which of course part of that Western system of government, which may be collapsing now in what is increasingly becoming West Asia.
And Crispin, Peter talked from the journalistic perspective. As a politician, David Cameron at time investigated the political Islam, which is the idea to which many of the massacre victims belonged, to be honest. Instead of investigating the regime action in the Rabba massacre. So it's a quite strange. You chair the Foreign Affairs Committee. So how did you find the conduct of British government regarding dealing with Sisi, who admit or did the massacre, and with the political Islam?
Well, the Foreign Affairs Committee, under my chairmanship, we did an inquiry into political Islam. And in parallel, we also did effectively an inquiry into Sir John Jenkins' inquiry into the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And it was perfectly clear that he had been invited to go and find the evidence to be able to nail the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and he couldn't find it. And so the conclusions in respect of the Brotherhood in the report are entirely generous. There's no, he couldn't find the smoking gun, literally. And the fact that it was I suppose the embarrassing thing, if you want us to actually believes in British fair play and fairness, is that we found ourselves reporting on in an investigation into the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, who had been on the receiving end of what happened at Rabba. And it had been done, as we've seen, knowingly and with malice aforethought. And they're probably rather grateful there were only 1,000 casualties, because it sounds as though they would have been prepared to tolerate 5,000. And that's really an appalling thing to think about. And some of the observations that have been made this evening about what could have been done, what ways could have been found to give Egypt some route eventually to democracy. But you closed it down once the military are soaked in blood of that scale. It's very difficult to see a way back. There is a human rights challenge to the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, there is, about individuals within. If you're going to punt a religious code in politics, you're going to have to deal with some rather difficult issues around individuals who don't accept that code. And subsequent to events of 2013, I engaged with Political Massacre, and did an inquiry into it with my committee in order to try and find the route. How do you accommodate religion in politics? How do you create a space on the democratic playing field for religious-based parties to be able to take part? What guarantees there need to be for people whose lives are going to be, if they don't conveniently fit with the religious codes that are being punted? And these are things that need to be reconciled. And to the Brotherhood's credit, certainly as far as its leadership is concerned, as far as I could see, they have made efforts not only to find ways of making those accommodations with modern society and the freedoms that are expected, but also, rather more profoundly, have managed to keep the lid on violent resistance through the ideology and the ideas that are coming out of the Brotherhood. It's probably why Egypt is not in flames now.
And Dalia, this was the UK, and what about the US? Penn Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor in the Obama administration, said in the critical testimony in the film that United States turned a blind eye to the military coup, announced withholding of military aid to Egypt. Then after a while, everything returned to normal. So from your point of view, what was the vision of the Obama administration and the United States administration dealing with the Rabba massacre and dealing with the Egyptian regime?
So if you remember, when the revolution was happening, the Obama administration was actually silent. Secretary Clinton at the time was not really talking about the street because it wasn't clear that this is what the United States wanted. It's only in President Obama's recent memoir and in Ben Rhodes looking back that, oh, there was this beautiful thing. And President Obama currently says, if I was a young man in Egypt, I would have joined the protests, right? But they're saying that now. Back then, they were playing. There was the signaling game happening with, does the American administration support what's happening in the street? And it wasn't until just before Mubarak stepped down that the United States started talking positively about what was happening. In terms of the military coup, yes, they did say that U.S. aid would be withheld, right? And Egypt receives $1.3 billion in U.S. aid. $1 billion of it is military aid. 2013, Secretary Kerry at the time said, we will put democratic preconditions, which you need to have elections for parliament, the writing of a constitution, and then presidential elections. That did not happen in Egypt, and especially not in that order. Actually, the parliament was canceled. The democratic preconditions were removed, and aid was reinstated. And in 2014, Egypt received $1.4 billion, so even more than before. And so if you think about what we're signaling to Egyptians, young Egyptians, is that no, we actually don't support democracy. In President Obama's final address to the United Nations General Assembly, he, in speaking about Egypt, said that the United States sees Egypt through the prism of security cooperation, flyover rights over Sinai, the Suez Canal, and the protection of the State of Israel. And that's what the United States would put its full military support behind, and counterterrorism cooperation. Things like human rights, democracy, are now up for conversations. And so what was signaled at the United Nations by President Obama was that the US's commitment to democracy and human rights is conditional. And it's conditional on the acceptance, which became very clear vis-a-vis the United States, that in the US, we were going to accept stability and democracy as two sides of the same coin. Democracy is messy. We're going to accept authoritarianism because that's where we're going to get stability from. But what we do know is that Egypt today is more unstable than it ever has been. The Egyptian pound used to, for $1 US, it was about 8 pounds in 2016. Today, it's 38 pounds to the dollar. We just saw a report.
In the black market. Yep.
We just saw a report come out of the World Bank that 54% of Egypt's GDP goes down to pay the interest that Egypt has taken. Our internal debt has increased threefold. Our external loans have increased threefold. The IMF has given Egypt $23 billion since 2016, and that has not been enough. And so Egypt has taken $27 billion from Gulf countries. Gulf countries today are no longer giving Egypt aid as a blank card. They now want exchange of Egyptian national properties, Egyptian national corporations. And so what's happening today is that the Egyptian government is selling Egypt piece by piece in order to get more funds. Because according to the World Bank, 70% of Egyptians live in poverty. And so if we look at stability, economically, Egypt's more unstable than it ever has been. Socially, this kind of pariah state has devolved into pariah society, where society has turned into not just othering, but those that are at all sympathetic with any type of religion are not of this new elite class that President Sisi is creating. It's not the elite of the Mubarak era. You have these new youth initiatives. He's hoping to create a new elite that's devoid of any type of religion, because now this is going to be a hyper-nationalist elite. It's not working. And so what is he doing just this week?
Okay, but if all this happened in Egypt right now, what does the stability mean for the United States administration?
It means increased repression. It means increased repression, because you know you can only get more stability today if you increase repression. But there's a breaking point. The biggest gift of the revolution was that the fear barrier is broken. Although fear is worse than it ever has been, today fear in Egypt is you actually can't say the sky is blue if the state does not agree that it's blue. Because if you have more than 4,000 Twitter followers and you say anything outside the national narrative, you can be arrested under terrorism charges for being against the state. And so fear has increased. And so what we know is that Egypt's unfortunately a tinderbox. 2011 showed us that change happens peacefully. My fear for Egypt is that the next cycle of change might not be so peaceful.
Okay, and Amr, over tenure, there have been repeated attempts from many people to persecute Sisi and the leaders of his regime who were involved in the massacre in 2013. This happened in the United States with Hazm al-Biblawi, the former prime minister, and this happened here in the United Kingdom with Mahmoud Hijazi, the former chief of army, among others. Nevertheless, all attempts failed. So, from your perspective, why? These all attempts failed and justice has been absent so far.
Sure, I would answer this question, but just very quickly, the previous question, I forgot to say, you were asking about the term we used usually to describe the Rabba protest, that it is largely peaceful, and that's why the use of violence was extremely disproportionate and excessive. And for some people, this is like a vague term or like hard to understand. It's either peaceful or violent. But no, it's not like that. There could be a largely peaceful protest, as in Rabba. I didn't work on the Human Rights Watch report, but I was there in the Rabba Square as a freelance journalist. I was producing for Al Jazeera English, and I spent almost 12 hours every day in the square, and I could say as a witness that it was largely peaceful. I didn't see any firearms for like almost 2 weeks working there, except on the dispersal day I saw only one firearm. And also by the end of the dispersal, by the end of the day, the Interior Ministry in Egypt held a press conference and said that they confiscated around 14 firearms. So for 14 firearms, you go ahead and kill 1,000 people. And of course, there was some violence from the protesters, whether throwing rocks or using sticks, or maybe some also had firearms. But this was not it was not a law enforcement operation to actually pinpoint those who are armed and and try to disperse the other protesters, tens of thousands of them, in other peaceful ways. There was no like graduation of the use of force. And this is not like mathematics. It's not like chemistry. There are very clear rules by the UN around the use of lethal firearms by law enforcement, especially in the context of dispersing protests. And the Egyptian government, simply missed every single principle or guideline offered. For the question about accountability, I think I mentioned in my answer to the previous question that even the Egyptian constitution said there should be a law on transitional justice, which never happened. Victims were never compensated. Actually, a lot of the Rabba survivors were victimized twice or even more than twice, because a lot of them were taken to mass trials and sentenced to lengthy prison sentences or death in very, very politicized mass trials before extraordinary courts that lack any resemblance of independence. And those who were participated in the dispersal were never questioned or investigated, from the lowest ranking officer to the the officials who actually produced the orders. And instead, actually, we saw that they were getting bonuses, they were getting praise. There was a statue erected in the square in memorial of whoever actually ordered the dispersal. So I think, nationally, domestically speaking, justice in Egypt is far from reach. Sisi's regime has actually co-opted the judiciary in ways that Mubarak never did. Maybe even Nasser never did that extent of co-option of the judiciary. Outside of Egypt, internationally, just in line with what our distinguished speakers have said about the just the lack of, to put it in the I would say the mildest way, the lack of enthusiasm to defend democracy in Egypt. There was not really a reaction to hold Sisi's government accountable to these serious crimes that we said they are crimes against humanity, and that means they have actually universal jurisdiction laws in many Western countries that they could use against Egyptian officials, and it also means that these crimes could be prosecuted before International Criminal Court if Egypt was a member of the Roma Statute. Unfortunately, Morsi, Allah yarhamu, he never actually signed the Roma Statute, which would have actually meant a lot for the Rabba survivors. The other way is to produce some sort of a statement in the Security Council and order the country or the officials to be taken to the International Criminal Court, which will never happen in the case of Sisi's regime in Egypt. So what remains is the universal jurisdiction laws in many of these countries, like the UK and France and other countries. Unfortunately, the diplomatic impunity, which Egyptian officials enjoy, or any officials in any country for that matters, automatically ceases any sort of investigations or any sort of like arrest orders, even though there were actually some quite serious attempts. We saw that Sisi, for example, canceled a visit to South Africa in 2016, if I remember, because of it was very, very unlikely for him to be arrested, but just because there was strong laws in South Africa about this, and it could actually go into an actual investigation. I also remember, I think Egyptian officials canceled visits to the UK in 2015 and 16 for the same reason. After that, we haven't seen much attempts. I think the diplomatic impunity is really a big hurdle, but also the lack of political will on the part of the governments in those Western countries.
Yep.
We have seen, it wasn't just the US that have very quickly resumed the military aid to Egypt. It was also the European countries, members of the EU, despite two statements by the European Commission for Foreign Affairs saying that all military equipment and export licenses to Egypt have to be revised. That these statements were in 2013 and 2014, but we have seen maybe over 12 European countries exporting arms to Egypt, including firearms and small arms that are used by the police to violently oppress the opposition. Some countries use a lot of these justifications to justify why they transport weapons to Egypt. So they say, for example, we transport only big weapon systems that are not used for internal repression, like, for example, the French Mistral or Rafale fighters. But actually, a lot of European countries give firearms to the Egyptian police. This comes from Italy, for example, from Belgium, and from many other countries. So if they are doing that, there's no wonder why it's not actually possible to activate the universal jurisdiction laws in these countries against Egyptian officials.
Peter, we were talking about the action of Western countries to the justice attempt. If we talk about the Western media coverage after the Rabba massacre, we all watched Craig Summers, the security chief at Sky, testimony about his colleague, his cameraman, Michael Dean, who was shot, killed in Rabba massacre. How do you see the media coverage of British mainstream media here regarding this Sky cameraman?
Well, obviously, Mike Dean is a very brave man who put himself in harm's way and was killed. It worries, but it does worry me that the dominance of this kind of narrative of the fate of a British journalist or a Western journalist. I felt very strongly at the time that there was a systemic neglect of the fate of Egyptian journalists. There is a prioritization of the quite upsetting and shaming if you're a Western journalist. You somehow place the fate of a white Western journalist much higher than of the countless Egyptian journalists who were locked up, tortured, killed, and so on. So I was very struck. Just one other point on the Western media coverage. The Tiananmen Square comparison you made there, Crispin. But of course, if you compare the coverage of Tiananmen Square and how the BBC went absolutely bonkers on the subject and It was the epic moment in the history of the world, and the muted response, always the Western media reflecting the official foreign policy position of Western governments, the very muted response to Rabba, once again showed that was something which I think calls into question the integrity, I should say, of a great deal of British foreign reporting and Western foreign reporting.
And talking about journalism and the value of journalism, the film showed a video clip of an Egyptian media figure loyal to the regime inciting the killing of the protesters in Rabba. So what's your comment on such a level of journalism?
Well, that isn't journalism at all. That is the sort of journalism which Goebbels approved of. That is propaganda, vicious propaganda of death. What? And criminal, yes.
Yeah. And Khaled, 10 years ago, you are witness Rabaa. Today, you are a journalist. The Middle East Eye covers the stories, reports on human rights and migration issues. So, what impact the Rabaa massacre had on your life?
Just before that, I have 2 points to follow up with Amr and Peter about the kind of violation that might happen during the dispersal from the people or civilians towards what was happening from the forces during the dispersal. It just was a normal resistance that we have done all over the revolution, from Tahrir Square till other events, Muhammad Mahmoud, Al-Abbasiyya, and all over. So basically, it wasn't something different. And even the military source that I have contact with, like, he was trying to warn us about the dispersal. He said that we know literally all the details and everything inside the sit-in. So they have the whole information about everything inside. If they have any doubt about kind of weapons inside, I'm sure that they could manage to expose it to the media, but they didn't have. And the other point about targeting journalists, during the dispersal, we have friends and colleagues who have been targeted and shot dead. Habiba Ahmed and Mus'ab al-Shami. And before that, in the Republic Guards events, Ahmed Asim. And they all just shot dead during their work, during their coverage of the events to show what's happening on the ground. Myself was kidnapped during the dispersal by forces and have been tortured, and they have tried just to take my camera, take everything that I had, and even to cut between my fingers with knives. So basically, the Egyptian journalists during the events, the virtual events since the revolution until the coup and what happened after Rabaa, there was a primary target to the regime on the grounds, and they just been silent by all the ways and all the means. Regarding your question, so basically, until today, during our reporting, we still hearing new stories about what happened, which clearly demonstrates the massive impacts of that day on all of us. Egypt, after Rabaa, is nothing like before. We are talking about thousands of political prisoners are still inside prisons in a very poor and like critical conditions. We are talking about media restricted, freedom of speech not exist anymore. Just anyone who tried to speak out, like, it just been silent. The military took over the state. They had the full control of everything, economics, media, investments, constructions, everything. Even now, the practice of the military and police forces that we are witnessing now, it's much, much worse than we have witnessed during Mubarak's era and before the revolution. So basically, Rabaa was just a turning point that was like establishment of the state of fear that just resulted what
It was
we
a
are
turning
witnessing
point
now.
for the country.
For the whole
But
country.
It was a turning point for you?
Everyone. So just like you are witnessing people inside prisons or in the exiles, people separated from their families all over the world. The one family are like just split in all over the world, like in Canada, in US, in Turkey, in the UK. Myself, I have all my families, I haven't met them like since like 5 years, and everyone is just in one in a different region. And yeah, this is exactly applied
Yeah.
for thousands of Egyptians after what happened.
Okay, yeah. Let's go to our audience, and we have a few Q&A questions. So we have volunteers around the inside the hall. Yeah, the man on the right, please.
Good evening, everyone. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Mustafa Ragab. I'm the director of Egyptian House London and also the president of the Egyptian community in Europe. I lived in the UK for over 50 years. I've seen everything, I witnessed everything that happened. What I've been listening to today is one side. There is two sides for every story. What I heard, what I watched, it's all about brotherhood. Have you interviewed the residents of Rabba Square?
This is your question?
What is your definition of a coup?
Yeah, what's your
Sorry,
question?
let me finish.
No.
Don't interrupt me.
What's your question? And for
you talk about
speaking.
democracy, so let
Yeah,
me finish.
this is a democracy, so I need your question,
so
please.
don't interrupt me.
No, your question,
What
please.
is your definition of a coup? A coup that you wake up in the morning and you find the president in
Sir,
prison.
you are asking and answering, or you are asking question?
I am putting
If you want to ask a
from
question,
myself.
please, just a second.
What
If
have
you
you done
want
there?
to ask your question, just go
Why
ahead.
you keep interrupting me? Everyone
you-
is free.
You are
believe in
answering
free
your question, sir.
world,
You are
yeah?
giving us the definition
Just-
of a coup. Just give me the
chance
question
to finish.
and let me go to our speakers, please.
I will say, what is
Go
your
ahead.
definition of a coup?
Yeah.
That didn't happen in Egypt.
What Mustafa's view represents is the terrible division in Egyptian society, and it was absolutely visible and apparent to me when I went there in 2013 and in 2014. Families split down the middle between, and you couldn't predict which person was going to take which position, even from their whatever strata of society they were in. But understanding that obviously Egypt is a society with an astonishing amount of the economic power in the hands of the military, and so one could talk about a military-industrial complex actually means something proper in Egypt, and how much of that was the potential reason why the military decided to follow the route that they did, I don't know. It'll have to be for others to decide. But Mustafa is, in a sense, at least he's been prepared to come here and put a opposite point of view, which he knows is going to rile everybody here. But how much he's then acting as an agent provocateur to people here, or standing up for what he believes, only Mustafa can know. But what we do need is both sides to turn the board round and look at it from the other side, and to understand why people have made the decisions that they have. And of course, in the case of the Egyptian military, the events of the 14th of August 2013, it is very, very difficult to see how that chain of command can ever be exonerated from the responsibility they have for the murder that occurred on an appalling scale.
Yeah.
But equally, in a society that is then trying to, and this goes really across the whole of the Arab world in particular, the tragedy that the Arab Spring has been, and the false dawn, it's perhaps played out longest in Tunisia, where Ennahda quite deliberately made its accommodation to try to mirror the development of the Christian democratic parties in Europe. And even that has not been enough. And of course, you then have on the flanks then the militants who will not accept any compromise at all. And then we've seen those movements sweep across Iraq and Syria in horrifying consequences for the people on the wrong end of it. My regret in all of this is that Western democratic liberal values in which I believe, that we haven't really stuck to them, and that we haven't demanded these standards of people and demanded the tolerance that is required if societies are to live together. People need to understand and accept the margins of individual freedom and the margins of political freedom that societies require if they're to not to end up being policed in a way where you have tens of thousands of your opponents in jail, of extrajudicial killings and the rest, and the appalling rebuke to everybody of the only elected president in Egypt's history dying in a courtroom.
Yeah, we can have two other questions. Yeah.
The one back or the one in front?
Yeah, here.
My question is to Dr.
No,
Dalia.
that.
Yeah, my question is to Dr. Dalia Fahmy, Professor, sorry. You said the situation in Egypt is unstable or shaken right now because of the economical pressures. And we see inflation all across the globe, not just in Egypt, but there is a lot of what's going on in Egypt is due to the wrong practices of Sisi. But my question is, when do you think it will be a turning point, or when it's going to take effect, when you presume or assume that what could be the trigger for the current situation to be in action or to see another wave of the revolution? That's my first question to you. I have another question also to Peter. And my question, you spoke about the integrity of the media in the West, and I think all over the world, it's not just the West. How far have you researched the movie industry stating or documenting historical facts, like in the modern history, not in the ancient history? I mean, during Mubarak regime, there was a lot of movement from certain there was like few films criticizing Mubarak and the government. There were comic artists drawing in the newspaper criticizing him. That's not the fact right now. How far did you dig into that? Thanks.
Thank you. Dalia?
So although I am not in the business of predicting the future, I don't think Egypt's going to take a turn for the better for quite some time, because the rise of populism is global. The reason why I answered before saying that I think repression might increase is I come from the United States, where we also had an attempted coup on January 6th, and our former president might become president again, and celebrates President Sisi as exactly what Egypt and the Middle East needs. And so let me put it this way. When I used to be invited to Washington to talk about the status of democracy in Egypt in the 2000s, it was getting to political pluralism. What does it mean to institutionally get to political pluralism? To have a judiciary that's an independent of the executive, to bolster parliament with the increasing number of political parties. Today, the conversation circles around how can we stop people from dying, and how can we get people out of prison? And so that's the nature of the social landscape and how we discuss not just Egypt, but the rise of hyper-nationalism and populism throughout the world. Egypt just also has hyper-nationalism, populism, and a populist leader. And just as we do in the United States, we also have television channels that play alternative facts day in and day out. So you have populations emerging, looking at two different versions of reality and two different versions of the economy. What we know today is that before the revolution, 20% of the economy was controlled by the military. Today, it's upwards of 70% of the economy is controlled by the military. There's over 60,000 political prisoners. Instead of building schools, the current regime has built 17 new prisons. And so when you celebrate a generation as Generation Protest all over the West, and now it's considered Generation Jail because the entire generation is either in exile, tortured, or currently in prison, you know, there are big question marks about the future. One of the things that'll be publishing soon looks at the gendered nature of all of this, and why is it that the regime continues to torture women with gang rape in prison? Why is it that this regime, you know, President Sisi is the one who ordered the virginity tests in Tahrir Square. There's a very gendered nature that is not just out to control society through fear, but also control society through controlling women in very particular violent ways. And so the vestiges of the coup and ultimately Rabba are getting deeper and deeper. And so I'm not optimistic, and it's for multiple reasons, and I'm sorry for that.
And Peter?
Actually, I don't have a knowledge enough of the Egyptian sort of media industry to say anything useful about that question. Thank you.
Okay. Man in the middle. Mike, please.
Thank you, Dr. Osama, for having this event, and thanks for all the panel and the audience. My question to the panel, maybe especially for Crispin, Dalia, and Peter, and the rest of the panel, obviously, this what called political Islam, or the Islam, just hating Islam to come, while what we've seen in the film and the documentary, that I think the Brotherhood and Islam in general, they did play well in democracy. They're the only, you know, sector or political sector that's actually played democracy and got a president, the first elected president ever. And this concern of the West, or this always the concern about Islamists, and even when we saw in the documentary that they enforce people to have niqab and hijab, we never heard that in the narrative of Morsi or Brotherhood at all, never. And they wanted what we heard from Morsi, that he wanted a modern, civilized country, and maybe with a background of Islamic sort of ideology, which is fair enough. If you elect Conservative Party, Crispin in Blood, he's conservative. He adopts his ideas and ideology. When he goes to power, he will not change it. So I think why this is, it's related to maybe the old colonization era. Is it the crusade? Is it I don't know why this fear of a democratic Islam, while it could really, we've seen in the history that Muslims, when they were in power, actually they're embracing in the Ottoman Empire that Jews and Christians lived all together in peace. So why this is happening? And maybe comment in the end, I disagree maybe a little bit about I agree maybe on the short term the future might be dark, but I believe that the history is written in years, but our lives are short. Maybe we live 60, 90, but I believe what Professor Dalia mentioned, that they've broken the fear. And this will, yes, it's be on a temporary anesthetic. I'm a doctor, so maybe anesthetized, but the body is not dead. The body is alive. And I still, you know, claim that I trust the new generations. I'm one of them, and my children, my new generations, I'm sure that they'll be coming for freedom to Egypt at some point.
Thank you. Who?
Well, obviously, we all hope so, even if it is rather difficult to see. And even 10 years after Rabba, that happening anytime soon, because of the accountability required, given what can only be described as an appalling crime by any standard. And it was a crime in the end against democracy, and which makes it, frankly, all the more serious as for it to be snuffed out in that way. And I suppose my hope of what very limited study I've done of Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is the restraint that they appear to have shown. And I'm entirely secular. And so the idea of having a code of ethics that is 1,400 years old or whatever it is, then imposing on my politics is something would seem just a little quaint and out of date, to my view. And what I think has to be done is an accommodation needs to be found, particularly for those movements who want to identify themselves with a particular set of religious ideas, as the accommodation they're going to make with everyone in their society who all want their individual freedoms, which is increasingly a part of the definition of individual human rights of societies and through the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. What is the boundary between the individual and the collective? And there will remain an anxiety that we have the situation in Iran where the Islamic Revolution is still going, where the constitution was ripped up and written only for Islamists to be able to allow to take part. Well, that certainly isn't democracy by my standard, because I should have to subscribe to religion in order to take part in the democracy of the country is obviously something that is anathema. And it's trying to make, therefore, the political movements that choose to identify themselves in that way, to understand what is therefore fundamentally objectionable about them if they choose to press that. And I think Enada has given a very good example as to how to try and find that accommodation. It's only a crying shame that the Tunisian model has failed in the circumstances that it's failing today.
Yeah, Dalia, Peter, you want to add anything?
Sure. So, a shameless plug, I have a book coming out called The Rise and Fall of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Future of Political Islam. Yeah. But, I trace the Brotherhood's electoral participation from 2000 until the removal of President Morsi, and you're right. Between 2005 2010, when the Brotherhood won 88 seats in Parliament and they were 22% of the Parliament in total, you saw the political activity of the Parliament function, and it wasn't on Islamic issues, right? It wasn't on should Egypt be part of Miss World or the kind of debates that people thought they would have. It was no, how do you secure the food supply because of avian flu at the time? How do you think about education that elevates the next generation higher? Now, the 2005 started to wane in 2007. And I don't know if you have it here in the UK, but in the US we have a C-SPAN channel, which is you get to watch what's happening in Congress. Egypt had one too, and the Brotherhood strategy was twofold, right? To show past corruption and also legislate for the future. And in the showing of past corruption of what happened to these budgets became a really big issue of this exposure of the levels of corruption. That channel was closed, and the following parliamentary election was the worst rigged election actually in Egyptian history, where not a single member of the Brotherhood running as independents because they were still illegal, and nobody was reelected. And that was December of 2010. You had a revolution in January 2011. And I argue that that was one of the causes. Now, when we think about the problem of the term political Islam, we have come to use Islam and political Islam interchangeably. And that's very problematic because the Brotherhood can fail, but we're talking about it like it's religion, right? Like it's sanctified and protected. One of the other miracles of the revolution was that historically under Mubarak, the reason why the Brotherhood was the only opposition party was because secular parties could not be formed, leftist parties could not be formed, other Islamist parties could not be formed. It was almost by design, part of the secularization of the state, that the byproduct created this social movement that had to take care of the people. And that became one of the largest social organizations. After the revolution, and then ultimately enter into politics. After the revolution, when the law that Mubarak had, the law on party formation, was rewritten, it was the first law rewritten, then there was a flooding of new parties formed. The first one was the Center Party, Hizb al-Wasat. In terms of the kind of political Islam shelf, you saw An-Naggar start a party, you saw Abu Futuh start a party, you saw almost immediately 7 new Islamic parties emerge. And so the Brotherhood no longer had a monopoly on religion. And if you really want to talk about getting to political pluralism, I wrote a piece called Getting to Political Pluralism, it was actually looking at that they were starting to have debates of what does religion look like in governance, right? Are we talking about a system of ethical principles, or are we talking about actual legislation? And you saw the conversation move to an inspiration rather than legislation. But that was very short-lived. And so part of the democratic process is getting to the moment you can have these deeper conversations of what does a secular state look like? What does a religious state look like? How can these coexist? Can they? Can a Christian Democratic Party differentiate itself from an Islamic Democratic Party? That was a beautiful moment that lasted just a few months, but it happened immediately. And what that should signal to all of us is that that was inherent in the conversation of Egyptians since then.
Yeah, and Amr, you want to add something?
Thank you, Osama. Maybe I just have like a brief comments on the various questions that were posed. I think before I came to the human rights as a professional, human rights defender, I was working in journalism, and also I was a political activist. And I think having spent almost over a decade in professional human rights activism, really gifted me with the perception that it is actually very beneficial to look at things that happened in Egypt and other Arab countries after the uprisings with a human rights prism or a human rights perspective. It really helps us understand and maybe also like express things in a more calm way, and also perceive what others says in a calmer way. And I think all political parties in Egypt, including the Brotherhood, secular parties, leftist parties, were guilty, very guilty of, and contributed to two lethal, I would say, two lethal sins that really antagonizes any sense of healthy politics, which is polarization and essentialism. And I think what happened in Egypt between 2011 and 2013 was really a huge gap of trust between political forces. And I think the Muslim Brotherhood contributed to that as well. And one of our distinguished audience members said that the Muslim Brotherhood was the only player who believed in democracy. But actually we saw and witnessed a lot of actions and statements by the Brotherhood after Mubarak stepped down that were very anti-democratic. They have effectively participated in what they are blaming the secular forces for in the Rabba massacre. The secular and leftist forces supported the military when they massacred pro-Morsi supporters in Rabba Square, but the Muslim Brotherhood also supported the SCAF, the interim government that was basically the military after Mubarak, when they massacred protesters in Mohammed Mahmoud, in Maspiru, in the cabinet massacre. Or at least they were not as condemning of the events, or at least they were also spreading what was circulated by the SCAF media back then, which basically is demonizing the protesters and calling them thugs, calling them scums, justifying virginity tests of the female protesters. And I think when you look at the things from a human rights perspective, you see that every part was guilty of something, and I think that helps you overcome some of the, just the very narrow corners that ideology usually pushes people to. And I think that doesn't necessarily make people like evil, but it doesn't help them understand what went wrong in order to actually arrive at a correct diagnosis and therefore a correct solution. And the correct solution, in my opinion, is when there is another like democratic transition in Egypt, is to actually push forward a number of very urgent democratic reforms, legislative reforms, democratic reforms that actually establishes the institutions in the country. And I think the very brief time that the Brotherhood held the majority in the government in Egypt between 2011 and 2013, they failed to do so. And I think I lived in Tunisia for 2 years as well, and I could see that also political forces in Tunisia were guilty of the same. They were more keen on, let's say, assuming power and getting their men in the state institutions rather than reforming these institutions. And there were very clear, like, abusive laws that could have been taken down very easily, very quickly in the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated parliament in Egypt. For example, also ratifying the Roma Statute, ratifying a few other international treaties, like the Treaty Against Enforced Disappearance, for example. Egypt is not, signatory of that treaty. There were a lot of, there was no lack of, I would say, ideas or thoughts or suggestions. Actually, a lot of civil society organizations and independent activists offered a lot of useful ideas how to reform the police institution, how to approach the military, because you can't also remove a military that ruled the country for 70 years from power overnight. That has to come gradual, and it has to come with certain concessions. So I think looking at things from a human rights perspective really helps us overcome sometimes what our ideologies blind us from seeing. And in June 30 events and then the July 3rd and then the Rabba Massacre, it's really important to look at things from a human rights perspective. And I don't really care when people say June 30 was a revolution. Okay, if that's your opinion, that's fair. You are entitled to that. But actually, now, if I say that June 30 was a coup in Egypt, I will go to prison. So you can't, there's no revolution that is followed by such, extreme, nationwide, systematic oppression of all basic rights. And
coming back at you, from a human rights perspective, there is no comparison of any kind between the barbarity which happened at Rabba and the occasional mistakes which took place under the Brotherhood. None at all. Cannot be compared from a human rights perspective. The other thing I'd say is Morsi had only been going for about a year. He had made a few mistakes. He was the first ever democratically elected leader of Egypt, and he was put out of business by the army. He had no right to do that at all. And this sort of relativism we're getting from your corner, I find a bit difficult. And just one final observation to go back to the question from the audience. One thing which really hurts me about this is it was a democratic movement, is a democratic movement. And if you were reading Al-Qaeda literature at the time, which I studied quite carefully, you had Zawahiri, of course, an Egyptian, saying, look, it's completely fake. The West will never allow it. The army will never allow it. Democracy has no chance. It's just a fake. And that you don't believe those guys in the Brotherhood. And I've talked to jihadists who were with the Brotherhood then, and they concluded that the only way forward is Al-Qaeda. And that was the message of the coup. And that is, I don't know whether that is still the great fear, because I haven't been to Egypt for 10 or 11 years. But that I think is what political Islam is. Wonderfully constructive movements right across North Africa and the Middle East, hated by the despotisms which are supported by the West. John Jenkins, a poodle if ever there was one, even he couldn't manage to amass the evidence that MBZ persuaded David Cameron to mount that inquiry. And I feel much more positive about political Islam than I think anybody else on the panel, actually. But I also fear very much that the West's complicity in the disabling of political Islamic movements are opening the way to very sinister and dangerous and bloodthirsty movements from below.
Yeah, thank you all. I need a final word from you, Crispin, and then final message from Khaled to his friends who left behind in Egypt after the Rabba massacre, and they are now in jail. So, Crispin, please. Okay, thank you. Khaled, please.
So basically, we are a generation that was willing to sacrifice everything to build a constitutional state, to build a modern Egypt, to have a just and freedom of speech and equality all over the society, to have the right of education, medication, respectful service. But we just didn't know the consequences of what we are going through, and what we were dealing with. Now we are like understand that this dream wasn't impossible, but it needs a lot of sacrifice that we already have done all over the years since the revolution in 2011 till the 2013. And even with what Amr mentioned and Peter, myself, with all my friends, we participated in all the events since the revolution till Rabba and after Rabba, because we were believing on protecting our democracy, regardless of ideologies. The fight and the actually fight between us and the deep state wasn't about ideology at all, because the state always used the ideology to sustainability of their power all over the state. So basically, we know that it's an independent fight between us and them, whether we were alone or not, but we are carrying on. For us, we are just trying to keep what happened in the memories of the next generations, to learn about what happened and to not repeat the mistake that we have done.
Thank you very much. At the end of this event, I want to thank you all. I want to say thank you for everyone make this event happen. Many thanks to our speakers, Peter Auburn, Dalia Fahmy, Crispin Plant, Amr Magdi, Khaled Shalabi, and Elizabeth Nagnet. And thank you for our great audience and for our volunteers. We will never forget the Rab'a massacre, and we will keep demanding democracy, freedom, and social justice as we believe in Egypt Watch. As you can see, our slogan, Egypt deserves better. Thank you.